Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today we are joined by political scientist Paul Buchanan, and in this episode we will deep dive into the big picture that hangs over the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That big picture, it has many aspects to it, and a resolution to the atrocities being committed in Ukraine will eventually probably be weighed against what is challenge to the international laws and rules-based order. In a previous episode in this series, Paul Buchanan and I examined how the world is transitioning into a democracies versus authoritarian bipolarity. In this episode, we'll continue in that theme, but we'll dig down into descendant powers or nations and how they try to create or tend to create or become entrenched in wars, and how Russia in 2022 fits this pattern. And there are comparisons to global Western powers too, which we will draw on. But in this episode, we will go further. We will examine how transitional international moments, conflict as a systems regulator, for example, can move to counter countries like Russia. And I'll get Paul to explain what we all mean by that very deeply. But before we deep dive into these issues, remember, if you are joining us live via the social media platforms, feel free to comment, make questions, put questions to us, as we can include this interaction into our program. So let's cross over to Paul, who is waiting online right now to discuss these issues. Good afternoon, Paul, and welcome.
Kia ora, Selwyn. Thanks. And a shout out to the audience who accompanies us on a weekly basis. We much appreciate it. And today we'll get into the big picture and see how that works out.
Yeah, the big picture. So, Paul, like we talked about there, we can see as we've dug down deep into in the previous episodes that the world is in a transition, and we're moving to two distinct groups, liberal democracies, if we want to put it that way, and also authoritarian nations and regimes, and that bipolarity is becoming very quickly the new normal. Can you take us into what you see as the big picture underlying this as well, and how it fits into a theoretical basis that has been well studied, and the various kind of ways of interpreting what we're all seeing? And then in the latter part of the program, we can look at why institutions, soft power negotiations relating to democracy, big and multilateral bodies like the United Nations, and even NATO to a degree, seem to be unable to address these problems that we're all witnessing right now.
Okay, let's start. Let's move back, let's say 30 years into the past, to the end of the Cold War. Now, I'm going to make this quick. Again, you just said it. There's ample literature on this. So what I'm saying is nothing new. The Cold War was characterized by what is known as a bipolar system with tight alliance structures around it. So you had the U.S. and the USSR as the polar opposites, nuclear tipped. And then the Soviets had the Warsaw Pact, of which Ukraine was part. And the U.S., of course, had NATO. And that was based on the logic of credible counterforce in order to enforce deterrence. You have two nuclear giants staring at each other through their alliance systems. You don't want to start wars that could escalate into nuclear exchanges. Well, the Cold War ends because the Soviet Union collapses under its own weight. And what we then saw was a rapid transition to a unipolar world, where the United States was the first amongst equals, what in the international relations literature is known as the hegemon, where it could defeat any constellation of adversaries on its own, didn't need allies to lay waste to the Chinese or the Russians or whoever. Now, that may be a product of American fantasy because it was never tested. Where the US was tested was in small wars like Somalia and that sort of thing. That period lasted from around 1990 to 2001. The precipitating event was not so much 9/11, but then the subsequent US invasion of Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. At that point, we started to move to what is yet incomplete, a multipolar world. And this new constellation will obviously include China. It may or may not include Russia, and we'll talk about that. At first, it was thought that it would be characterized by the emergence of the so-called BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, possibly South Africa.
Which is a trade bloc in many respects.
Well, the thought was that their collective economic power would translate into hard power. That even though the distance that separates them is great, that they could form military coalitions out of their common economic interests. That's known as issue linkage. So you link security to trade. Well, during the course of that time, and it's ongoing, the emerging world starts to shift and shape, and not quite in the ways predicted, but we are still headed to a multipolar world. And what's happened, among other things, is that the BRICS, again, under their own weight, have lost the opportunity to become an emerging power bloc on the world stage. Brazil, because of its flaws in its political system, has retreated from the world stage. India under Modi has become ethnocentric. And yes, it will eventually become a great power, but that's been stalled. South Africa is in limbo. So the BRICS are not the dominant emerging bloc. So
and you've got the People's Republic of China and India, border skirmishes there.
They're not going to get along. Yeah. You're exactly right. They're not going to get along. So, the idea that the BRICS were the new modern alliance system, and then to which you would add the United States, that's over. But here's the interesting thing, and here's where we start moving up to current events. The literature says that the most unstable international system is a unipolar world because all of the hegemon's rivals are sharpening their knives while the hegemon tries to keep control in far-off lands. And that's exactly what was going on with the United States. China, Russia, adversaries big and small were biding their time as the U.S. entered into wars of opportunity like that in Iraq and got themselves bogged down like they did in Afghanistan. So, you begin to see emerging here a move to multipolarity, which it turns out is the most stable form of international system. Why? Because if you have 3, 5, or 7, it's always an odd number, of great powers balancing each other on specific issues, then no one of those powers can dominate the world scene. So most international relations scholars were welcoming the move to multipolarity. But the old-timers, the old-time realists, cautioned against this idealism because they said, well, that's all true. It's clear the United States is no longer the hegemon, and it's just going to become another one of the great powers, and those are emerging. But in the transition, and these are long transitions, 2 or more decades, in the transition from unipolarity to multipolarity, again, not yet consolidated, what you're going to see is conflict, economic conflict, cultural conflict, diplomatic conflict, and unfortunately, military conflict. Why? Because conflict, as you said, is the system's regulator in a period of time that is uncertain and in which the established norms and rules are being challenged. How are they being challenged? Well, here's where we get into ascendant and descendant powers. that movement is characterized by two things: the emergence or ascendance of what used to be medium powers into great power status. So let's think of India. India, was always sort of the third world, and now it's slowly coming up. China is the best example. China has gone from being a backwards country to a formidable economic and military great power. No doubt about that. But the other side of this ascendance equation is that for all that they emerge or for all that they ascend to, there will be powers that are on the decline, that are descending powers. And the classic case is the United States. It's no longer the hegemon and no longer is the superpower that it once was. Here's where the realists get concerned. They say, well, that conflict that characterizes the transitional moment is mostly characterized by the descendant powers trying to cling on to the old status quo.
And in some ways, did that explain in some ways the invasion that the United States led with its coalition into Iraq?
I would say it does, because they were trying to remake the Middle East into the preferred image of what they called the Pax Americana, the American peace. It was Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld's vision.
Yeah. I remember writing a piece that was headlined Imperial Pax Americana at the time in 2003 in that advance. That certainly seemed to be the case, didn't it?
But it was a pipe dream, because the U.S. has been in decline for more than 2 decades. It's been slow, but it accelerated after 9/11 because they got themselves in fights that they shouldn't have. Again, wars of opportunity, not existential wars. And I'll come back to that theme in a second. Now, all of us who study international relations looked at the transitional moment after 9/11, and the general assumption was, well, there's going to be conflict, and eventually that conflict will become military somewhere. Hopefully, it'll be around the periphery of the world where great power core interests are not at stake. So they fight around the margins of what you call the essential. But it turns out that the wars that will come about, and again, they're inevitable, will be started by the descendant powers, not by the ascendant powers. The ascendant powers are going to create a new status quo. The descendant powers are clinging to what once was. And so the general consensus was that the United States is going to start wars in its decline. And those wars could get out of control. They could start out as small regional conflicts and then metastasize into global conflicts.
And we saw to a degree, I suppose, in that way with respect to the United States under Donald Trump. We saw the initiations, if you like, of heading toward and the trade war with the People's Republic of China. It's not a military conflict at that juncture. But I suppose there were many in the world that feared that it very easily could be. And what we understand for the dying weeks of Donald Trump's influence, that is very, very delicate with respect to his decision-making relating to hard power assertion leading to military conflict with another global power. So with that, we saw Joe Biden coming in. And Joe Biden, in his first bilateral meeting with Vladimir Putin as a president of the United States, exited that bilateral meeting with Vladimir Putin. And he made a few interesting comments that stick in my mind. And he said if he was Putin, he would be worried about the Russian Federation's economics. They are reliant on fossil fuels, the old economies that other nations were reliant on decades ago. It has nothing else. Now, what he may have been doing was stating the obvious, stating a fact. But if you're in Putin's shoes, Putin is starting to realise they know we're in our descendancy economically, which has an overflow into all other areas. And so therefore, it's also a situation where perhaps in his brain and in his mind, he's thinking, our adversaries, our opponents, they know we are struggling economically in the long term going forward. And then you've got this situation of a descendant power. Are those dots correct, Paul?
They are. In fact, you're anticipating something I was about to say, because while the world was focused on the U.S. in decline, and it still is, and Trump's attempts to pull back troops from various parts of the world was sort of a last-ditch effort to get us to extricate the U.S. from the bloodletting that was constantly going on. And everybody's focused on the United States, and under Trump, IR theorists, IR international relations theorists, were alarmed because this guy's a crazy man. I mean, we don't know what he's going to do. And I'll tell you, a lot of scholars were like, Trump's going to start a war. He's going to, and a war, and here's the key, a war he cannot finish.
Yeah.
Right? So you start a war and you win. Oh, great. But that's the problem with declining powers. They start wars, they don't finish them. So everybody's focused on the United States. And I include myself, and what we're not looking at real closely is Russia. That Russia, other than its military might, is a hollow shell. That it's a nation in quite possibly terminal decline. I'll give you some real quick stats. The average life expectancy of Russian men is 10 years below the OECD average. Russia has the highest suicide rates in all of Eurasia. What was the other one? Its infant mortality rates have turned around from being low under the Soviets to now being sort of middle third world. I mean, children die there. And income disparities between the upper 1% and everybody else are astronomical. This might as well be Brazil. I mean, the way they've gone. So you got a guy like Putin. He's looking at his own nation. Birth rates are negative. The Russian population is not repopulating itself. So they have immigration issues. They got to bring in labor. They're bringing most of the labor in from the Caucasus and from the stands. But white Russians don't like those folk. So now you got racial issues going on. So, Vlad the invader is looking out over this panorama, and he thinks to himself, there's only one way that I can stave off this decline, and that's to ideologically hark to the past glories of the Tsarist regime and Imperial Russia. Won't even talk about the Soviets other than a geographic entity. And I'm going to have to grab someone's territory. And by doing that, I can probably leverage the West into accepting a new status quo that has us as a leading member. Now, the thing that encouraged him to get into the Ukraine, and we've talked about this, is the perception that the West is weak, that the West is divided, that they will not respond to an act of aggression like the invasion of the Ukraine.
And there's also that irony where we've talked as well that Russia has survived in history's past, times past, on a buffer between heartland Mother Russia and forces of the West that have threatened it on its border. So we see the expansion of NATO, and we discussed this in earlier episodes, the expansion of NATO. There is the real prospect and dialogue starting to become open sourced relating to Ukraine joining NATO. Ukraine comes under the NATO umbrella. It is gone for good. Russia can never claim in any way what it believes is rightfully its. Now I'm talking about what Putin and what some elites in Russia may believe is rightfully it. So they've got that situation where the threat of a combined multilateral body that is security orientated is building up and starting to lap into what Russia feels is its uncomfortable zone. And you've got these other forces that you're talking about here that are happening within the psyche and the thinking and the objectives and also the longevity perhaps of the elites from that point of view too. So Paul, that's the tapestry, isn't it, that we saw starting to knit together. What comes next?
Well, the thing is, I have this little syllogy in my head about Vladimir Putin and Russia, and it goes like this. Isolation leads to miscalculation, leads to escalation. By that, what I mean is, as many autocratic leaders have done in the past, Putin has increasingly isolated himself from his cabinet and from the population at large. He can manipulate everything from above, but he increasingly is surrounded by yes men, people who will not tell him the bad news, people who will blow sunshine up his skirt, to borrow a phrase. And that led him to miscalculate. How did he miscalculate? In two major ways. He first thought that his troops would be welcome into ethnic Russian speaking areas of eastern Ukraine. As it turns out, they were welcomed in some parts, the separatist controlled regions. They were not welcomed by Russian speakers in other parts of the eastern Ukraine. They're fighting back.
That was a surprise for everybody, wasn't it?
For everybody. And you know, that's why, I mean, I'm a big fan of human intelligence, and not to get into weird spooky stuff, but that's why you need human intelligence collectors on the ground, because satellite photos won't tell you the mood of the people. You know, won't tell you, no, these guys, they prefer to be Ukrainian, Russian speaking Ukrainians, but Ukrainian nevertheless. They're looking over at Russia. They see what it is. Ukraine looks a little better. So he miscalculates on the war side. He doesn't get the support. And the errors are tactical. We've talked about, you put your fuel up with your armor as you run in on the invasion. He did not put fuel or water amongst his tanks and armored personnel carriers. Why? Because he thought he could borrow it from the local population, drive up to a petrol station and refill. Well, that isn't happening. So that explains part of why his armored columns are stuck, because they have no fuel. And there's more to it than that, but you know, he miscalculated there. The other miscalculation was that he thought that NATO would fracture, that he would be able to Finlandize the Baltic states, sort of drive a wedge between NATO countries, and thereby weaken them even further. What happened instead? He reunified NATO. NATO was created in 1948 as a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it really had no purpose. They got into peacekeeping. They were involved in Libya. They were involved in Afghanistan in the ISAF coalition. But you know, it was an alliance without a core purpose, which had been to defend against the Soviet Union. This invasion has just reunified everybody around the exact same cause, except now we call it Russia instead of the Soviet Union. But he's doing the exact things that NATO was designed to counter.
Yeah, now, we see just before you do, with NATO, we've seen it working as a solid bloc, and you know, from the economic sanctions, we talked last week about the constraints on the SWIFT financial transaction platforms, the Swiss even outside of NATO, but the Swiss coming on board and freezing the assets of oligarchs. We've dealt to all of that. It looked like NATO working on countries that were initially soft on the economic sanctions, namely Germany and also Italy, and Poland really forcing its diplomatic efforts on its NATO member states, its fellow NATO member states, to get them in line and get them on message, if you like, and it seems successful in that. What we've seen in the last 24 hours, however, is when it comes push to shove, the Polish were pushing for responding to the call from Ukraine for air power. The Ukrainian Air Force, those pilots, they know how to fly MiGs that were left over basically from the Soviet period, yeah?
Right.
Poland's got a whole, squadrons of these things. Poland wants to send the MiGs down so that Ukraine pilots can force some sort of leverage on the Russian air supremacy at the moment. The United States looked like it was on message with this, that it was a coordinated effort. We saw Blinken talking about, the need to supply in some respects. And then we understand this morning, New Zealand time, the United States has gone cool on that effort. I don't want to get bogged down into operational things because we're talking big pressure, but that's a confusion. Is NATO, when it comes push to shove, will Russia actually identify weakness within the structures of those members that make up NATO, and use that particular opportunity as leverage for its own efforts?
Well, that's their best. That's their best hope. But let me back up a little bit because you brought up a very interesting question that raises yet another miscalculation. Putin and his cronies anticipated that there would be sanctions imposed against the oligarchs, against the elites. So we have it on reliable information that a lot of these oligarchs move their super yachts out of European waters, and apparently they're in the Maldives and places like that. What he never imagined was that the Russian banking system would be booted out of the SWIFT codes, that the sanctions regime would be deep. It would be broad, as we've talked about in the past. He just miscalculated again because he's getting bad advice. And it was like, no, when we invaded the Crimea, there was some sanction against all oligarchs, and they were easily avoided. These sanctions have teeth. And so now he's going to be suffering crippling economic consequences. He never imagined that the Germans would agree to cutting off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline because they felt, well, these guys are going to freeze in winter, if they do this. The Germans went ahead and said, we're going to do it. We'd rather freeze than allow you to get away with this aggression. His hope is that NATO will still fracture. And this gets interesting. I saw what you saw with the U.S. backing off. Think of it this way. He's now bluffing that he's got his nuclear forces on red alert. But if Poland were to come in on the side of the Ukraine, and the Polish have just offered aircraft, they haven't offered troops yet.
Yeah.
Poland is a non-nuclear state. So if you nuke a non-nuclear state because they're providing logistical assistance to the Ukrainians, then you're going to get the full weight of NATO coming in.
And we know that there are preemptive defense protocols that the United States has and that NATO has. And so if its intelligence picks up and believes it's imminent, then you've got regional expansion outside of Ukraine.
Oh, absolutely. And they cannot see, this is the thing. Russia cannot win this war. It cannot. Even if it overthrows the regime in Kiev, it still has the Western Ukraine to occupy. It'll have a very restive population picking off its soldiers right, left, and center. It cannot win. And that's trouble for Putin. We've talked about he could be a dead man walking. With regards to NATO, were he to make a move on anyone but the United States and the UK, which are nuclear powers, that invokes the Collective Defense Treaty. And then you have the militaries of all of these countries pushing the Russians back. They won't go into Mother Russia, but they'll join the fray in the Ukraine and they'll kick some rear because you've got the collective might of 12 countries. The Baltic
and
states
for the audience, they may see references in the general news and in discussions like this to Article 5 of NATO's thing. And this is what you're talking about, invoking Article 5, isn't it?
Yeah. So, they would be very rash to go after a NATO member because they're providing logistical support. Now, I happen to think that the Ukrainian calls for a no-fly zone over the Ukraine, but certainly over Western Ukraine, are a reasonable thing. It involves calling bluffs. If you put, let's say, NATO fighter jets over Western Ukraine and Russian aircraft challenge them, there will be shoot downs. At that point, if you don't shoot, he's going to shoot. There was some mention in a commentariat this morning that, we're just going to go in and that they'll see us there and they'll turn around because they don't want to get into a fight. That's a fundamental misread of Russian aviation. If they see you there, they're going to shoot you. They think they have claim to the Ukraine. So if you partition the airspace, the Western Ukraine for humanitarian relief, that way you can get in plane loads, not only of humanitarian relief, but of weapons into Ukrainian hands, the Russians got to decide, do we want to up the ante into a fight with NATO, or do we try to consolidate what we got and find some way to get out of here while saving face? And that's a key thing, Selwyn. And you may know this already because you're onto this sort of stuff. when you're in a confrontation like that, and it's very clear that one side's going to lose, that side has two options. It can either surrender, announce defeat, and go home with its tail between its legs, which is not good for the leaders who initiated this war, or it
particularly
can
when
escalate.
particularly when you're an authoritarian leader. There's so much more
I
of
mean,
the
again,
culture, the macho culture. There's all sorts of elements to it, and perhaps there's a big argument that women make better leaders in conflict. So,
yeah, I'm not going to touch that one today.
no, I just put it out there.
It's a little above my pay grade. I got enough trouble convincing the women in this house to listen to my orders. There, now you got me completely sidetracked about what would Margaret Thatcher have done. No, the deal is
I'm thinking about the new generation of women leaders, one that I think the world would be much more stable. But let's just put it out there and
no. But here's the second part. There's an axiom in warfare, and generals know this very well. You got to leave the enemy an out. You got to leave him an avenue by which he can surrender or retreat gracefully. Don't corner him.
Yeah.
If you corner him, he becomes a rat. He will escalate. And what we're seeing now, we talked about this last week, it started out as a limited territorial grab designed to overthrow the regime in Kiev. It's now taking on the features of a war of annihilation, targeting civilian centers in order to psychologically break them. That's not good. Wars of annihilation, it was thought, ended with World War II. And everybody learned their lessons. It ended with a nuclear bang. And now he's starting to resort to targeting of civilian centers. Those are war crimes.
There's been a line that has crossed in the last 7 days. So overnight, and when we have a quick break and we come back, we'll touch into this, how hospitals, maternity wards have been selected and targeted. This is women giving birth to newborn babies. This is basically state terrorism. And, in simple languages. And this is a turning point for Putin. There is no going back now. This is the kind of atrocities of which the rules-based order, the legal, international legal system operates on, that has now been abandoned. It is at a point where it appears that the multilateral bodies, such as the United Nations, because of the structure at the Security Council with the veto powers of the P3 nations, are unable to do anything about that. That the UN Charter itself has been abandoned as a guiding principle of rules by this type of skirmish. Russia's not the first to thumb its nose and to give two fingers or even one finger in the air to the rules-based order. We saw this with respect to the way the United States operated inside of Afghanistan, in Iraq, where war crimes were committed, but there is no consequence. We know that too by countries that supported different elements of that, like with even respect to New Zealand's involvement in Afghanistan. They committed atrocities in there. It's well documented here in New Zealand thanks to the works of Nicky Hager and John Stevenson. We understand what went on there and been huge inquiries into it. But there's been very little consequence to, one, the New Zealand Defence Force for the atrocities, the breaches, one could argue, of international human rights that occurred in there, and certainly by the United States personnel, Nordic countries even, the Australians. Everybody has been a part of this destabilisation of the rules-based order, and Putin obviously is saying, well, I'm going to do this and I don't give a damn. So let's take a break and we'll come back, Paul, at this point, and we'll discuss what can be done and what happens when the rules-based order has gone. What kind of theory is there that can help us understand and predict what avenues can be taken? For example, I'll just put it out there and raised it in part in the introduction, that NATO, is it security blocs like NATO that represent a polarized, one side of a polarized world? Is that the way of reasserting security, but at huge cost of conflict? So we'll just take a break and we'll come right back. Won't be a moment here. As we're just saying to Paul, we're coming back into part 2 of this deep dive into the global situation and how things are changing very quickly. And I'll just touch on where we're going with the second part of the program. In 2022, for example, the United Nations Security Council, due to the P5 nations having veto powers, appears no longer fit for purpose. A UN-led multilateral response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is highly unlikely to come out of the Security Council because of that fact. The United Nations General Assembly, well, it appears frustrated too by Russia's refusal to acknowledge the combined insistence of the UN General Assembly that it cease its war against Ukraine. And NATO, at this juncture, we can see that because of its structure and its obligations, cannot directly defend Ukraine or Ukrainians, as Ukraine was not a member of NATO prior to the invasion that Russia initiated. And so I suppose in summary, before we get back to Paul, that the rules-based law and rules-based order that the globe has worked on since 1946 provides security and stability at the world at times, but sometimes, as we've seen in 2022, it commits conflict to burn on. So let's cross back to Paul and we'll discuss what can be done to reset such things and provide such resolutions to such challenges. Paul, it requires serious analysis, and this is one of the times when it's really good to have you alongside. So if we look at the problems, the frailties of the rules-based international order, as we've seen in 2022, if there was a reset that emerges out of all of this conflict, and I'll just underscore at this point, what we're talking about is not a remedy to the awful atrocities that are happening to the people inside of Ukraine as we speak. But what do you see as the possibilities coming out of this particular thing, and from a realism point of view?
All right. Well, we first have to understand, speaking to the larger picture, that those moments of transition that we talked about earlier, I pointed out that conflict is the system's regulator, but those moments of transition are also characterized by what is known as norm erosion. The rules and norms of the old order come under challenge, are pressured, and something emerges at the end that may be very similar or very different to the old rules and norms of the previous order. So we're seeing norm erosion. And where norm erosion is most heavily felt is in the lack of enforcement capability. If you can't enforce, laws against genocide, the laws of war, because of selectivity in application, then people like Vladimir Putin will take advantage of that. We'll go, no one's going to come and arrest me for war crimes. That's not going to happen. So I'm going to do them. And therein lies the rub, because there hasn't been consistent enforcement of norms governing conflict, both the build-up to and then the prosecution of conflict. Quite frankly, selective people have been prosecuted for various crimes, but you mentioned it. No Americans have been prosecuted for, in an international criminal court, which the U.S. doesn't even recognize, for any crimes committed against civilians in conflict.
It did under Bill Clinton, but that was chucked out under George W. Bush, wasn't it, for their own reasons, immediately prior to going in on Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, and as you say, there's even good old New Zealand is been, a little squirrely when it comes to some of the actions of their troops. Although in defense of the NZDF, I'll say by and large, they have behaved much better than some of their allies. But
except the children and the mothers and the civilians that were murdered in a couple of operations, of which has been well and truly public canvassed, wouldn't see it in such terms, I don't believe.
No, they wouldn't. They certainly wouldn't. But you're not going to see any New Zealand soldiers prosecuted here or in the International Criminal Court. You might call that professional courtesy between Western liberal democracies. It stinks, but it's exactly the root of the problem. If you don't have consistent and even-handed enforcement of universal norms, then you have nothing. And we're in a transitional moment where conflict was inevitable and where descendant and ascendant powers are now vying for supremacy. So you have no universal norms. They're honored in the breach. And out of all of this will come a new order with new norms. And that's where I think the comment about reset is excellent, because not only will Vladimir Putin not succeed in his ambitions vis-a-vis the Ukraine, but I believe as a result of watching this and maybe getting involved, I think this is headed towards NATO involvement. If he gets further bogged down, commits more atrocities, targets the civilian population, the world has to act. And the Europeans, I mean, they're right there. I mean, we live far away from everybody, but these people are in very close proximity. They got to stop it. It's like a cancer. They got to stop it now. So out of this, not only will Putin be defeated one way or another, but we're going to have a reappreciation of the rules-based order. That doesn't mean that the rules will be the same. Liberalism has taken some heavy hits, not just in the military field, but also in the economic field as a result of the pandemic. So, certain trade rules and all of that may come under closer scrutiny. But what I think is going to be the most obvious result of this, and again, you anticipated this, I think the UN is going to be increasingly marginalized. And what we're going to see is a resurgence of regional-based alliances amongst like-minded countries in a region that will do two things. It will serve as a conflict mediator within the region. So you mediate disputes before they become wars, shooting wars. And it will provide for the collective defense of that regional alliance from extra-regional aggression.
And we know what NATO is. In 2022, you saw the Russian Federation making reference to its own security pact, which involved obviously Belarus, but also some of the Stan states. And so this is popping up into the public sphere more often than it has done historically. And so we can see the thinking and the shifting into this type of arrangement that you're detailing and defining here too.
What's interesting is the, what is it called? The Conference or the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, involved Russia, Albania, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan, and Belarus. So 5 states plus Russia. That was formed in 1992. And it explicitly stated that it was being formed as a response to NATO expansion. So the Russians have their own guys. Now, here's a very big problem. Putin is threatening to invoke the collective security clauses of the CSTO and bring Kazakh troops, bring Belarusians, bring Uzbekistanis. They will be committed to the fight in the Ukraine. If that happens, I mean, that would be terrible. But if that happens, it basically opens the door for NATO involvement. So all that's checking his move to get the CSTO involved is he knows what's going to happen. Then NATO says, we have there's no reason why we can't get in because he's bringing in outsiders. Now, I find it interesting that particularly the United States keeps on saying, well, Ukraine is not a NATO member. So, and then they all start demurring. Well, where is it written that you can't unilaterally go and help out a kindred nation? You don't have to be part of NATO.
It's happened in the past. And we've seen, the president of Ukraine calling out for assistance. His country and his people, his elderly, his children, his women are dying and are being targeted by the oppressor. On a humanitarian position. Once again, the multilateral bodies kick in, don't they? But we saw the United States bypass all of that with respect to Iraq and went in on a coalition thing. So in some ways that breaks down the supremacy or the point of having NATO itself. So it's like a catch-22 situation, in a sense. But you're saying that that would be mission creep on behalf of the Russian Federation if it pulls in its security pact, fights on territory that is Ukraine, then NATO thinks, okay, this has changed. We're in.
Exactly. I mean, again, there's nothing that should stop Australia from sending troops to support Ukraine. They have the capability. They could fly in directly. They can set up in Western Ukraine, and that leaves the Ukrainians further room to fight the Russians on the eastern side of the Dnieper River. There's nothing stopping us, small as we may be, from sending our special forces guys to do what they do in and around the front lines. I mean, there's absolutely nothing stopping them. NATO has its collective causes, but any individual state, if it wanted to, could get involved. And the thing is, then they'd have to deal with the Russians directly. I think New Zealand and Australia are in a great position because the Russians are going to have a hard time trying to reach out and hurt us, given that they're occupied elsewhere. The key is this. I think that the demurring on the part of the United States in particular is a way of giving Putin an out. I think what they're doing is trying to hint to him, you're not going to win this.
They don't want that rat analogy, a cornered rat, which Putin used himself only weeks ago prior to the invasion.
Yeah,
we spoke about this off air last week. He was a child, just to touch briefly on it. He's a child growing up in an area which is, it's not a privileged part of the Soviet Union at the time. As a child, he had a sport on his own. He'd corner and chase rats and blah, blah, blah. This rat, he described to a journalist only a matter of weeks ago, that rat, he said, it stood in the corner and he learnt you don't corner a rat because it started spitting at him. And then the thing attacked him, he said. It didn't go for his hands or his feet, it went for his face. And he realised, and then it was just a cold, sobering message from Putin. He says, you never corner a rat.
No, indeed. And hey, I'll give you give you a little bit of trivia. So it turns out with open source intelligence gathering and whatnot, there's some phenomenal websites that are tracking battlefield damage in the Ukraine on both sides. And they've accumulated satellite photos, cell phone photo, you name it. And here's one little tidbit. The Russians did the invasion when it began. They had around 870 main battlefield tanks. Today, they've lost 170 of them already. They have lost dozens of rocket launchers, either through damage, capture, or abandonment, because some of these are perfectly fine, but there's no crews. They've taken off, and they're finding uniforms on the ground where these crews have taken off their uniforms, and they're trying to beat feet back to Russia looking like civilians. That attrition rate, okay, so we've gone, 2 weeks, 170 out of 850 thereabouts. If this keeps up, he's not going to have any armor, within a month and a half.
So he needs expansion. If we get back to that principle that you're raising up there, he needs his security alliance from the other countries. If that gains momentum and starts to steamroll, Paul, let's get back to this theory, perhaps, of this post-Ukrainian order, and even where we are now, where we're seeing the evidence of regional security blocs that represent the polarized interests in a bipolarity structure, I suppose is a way to put it, in the globe. We can see in some ways the Australians and the intelligence heads in Australia open sourcing this premise with respect to Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific region as well. In a sense that the UN is unable to be relied upon in such ways that these regional security blocs. Do you believe that if this does manifest as a framework and a structure of Western liberal democracies and authoritarian states on the other side, do you see that the world can enter into a stable pattern, a square off of defence groups like this, providing some sort of new normal peace, or is it global anarchy where they don't hold the line?
No, I don't think that anarchy is going to result from this. I think it's going to be a reconsolidation of some institutional structure. But let me point out something, because you and I have talked at some length about the emerging bipolar order being authoritarians versus Democrats. This changes the whole equation, because you can be an authoritarian and still favor a rules-based order. Think of Singapore, one-party authoritarian state, but very much embedded in the norm-based system. So authoritarians, for their own interests as well as the collective interest, can well accept a rules-based order that curtails their options, but it curtails everybody else's. And on those grounds, without meddling in domestic affairs, democratic countries and authoritarian countries can coexist peacefully. I mean, I think that's what's going on. There's a reappreciation of the importance of rules and norms, and the importance then leads to the need for enforcement.
Yeah, because I was going to say, you can have all the laws that you like, all the rules that you like, but if there are no consequences when they're broken, well, then they're meaningless. So you're talking now, you're saying, right, you're into that space and you say, but they need to be enforced. So how can they be enforced?
Well, that's just it. I think that this war has made everybody realize we've got to go back and put some muscle into the enforcement regime.
This reset of the whole thing,
Yeah,
has different elements.
Yeah, and so it would have to include things like committing to the prosecution of war criminals. An example would be Assad and his henchmen, that the international community says this guy has committed atrocities on a grand scale, irrespective of the fact that the Russians helped him during certain periods. He must stand trial for these atrocities. And we're going to put out an international arrest warrant on him. We're going to monitor his borders very closely. And eventually, much like the Israelis tracking down Nazi war criminals 30 years later.
But with respect to Syria, once again, this is an element of, I hesitate to use the word retrospective, but what we've seen with consequence or recourse via the International Criminal Court has been black and brown faces mostly, and then we've seen Serbian people obviously tried for the problems in the Balkan states, but there've been no consequence for the Western elites that have equally have committed war crimes at operational level, if not at political level. And it seems to be an impossibility. So once again, we get to the same kind of stalemate where how can a rules-based order work as a deterrent when the West has got a history of it as well, of breaches as well?
Yeah, listen, I completely sympathize with my leftist friends who point out the hypocrisy and the racism involved in the response to the invasion of Ukraine, and then various, the genocide happening now in Yemen, the treatment of Palestinians, yes, the hypocrisy. I coined a phrase for another friend. I said, hypocrisy is it's the currency on which diplomacy thrives, right? Diplomacy is all about hypocrisy masquerading as righteousness. We have to end that. And again, my lefty friends are perfectly right in saying this is hypocritical, but this is a moment because it's so egregious, this aggression. The Ukraine was not threatening Russia. You can revise history. They had nothing. Well, they didn't even have. Well, they had no intent, much less the weapons, to threaten Mother Russia. Again, a nuclear state.
Yeah.
And so, if ever there was a clear case of aggression, preemptive or preventative aggression, whichever one you may want to justify it with, the fact is this is a test case for the international community. And I think, again, even authoritarians who otherwise would like to form a bloc with the Chinese and the Russians, maybe the Turks, some pro-authoritarian minded alliance system, they need to understand that this could happen to them. I mean, Putin's basically saying, might makes right. I will throw out some random excuses, and then I'm going to do it because no one can come back and prosecute me. No one can touch me when I do these things. So here's what you do. And I'm going to recall my days in doing human rights field work in Argentina. We went down because we were trying to uncover the atrocities of the military regime. And one of the things that was done, very effectively, mind you, was that international human rights people would go to captains, lieutenants, and sergeants who were known to have committed atrocities and say, okay, here's the deal. We will give you immunity from prosecution if you tell us who gave the orders. We want the intellectual authors of these atrocities. In Argentina, they killed 30,000 people, including women and children. So, it was a hard decision to make because some of these guys were sadists. But you say, okay, you guys are going to get to walk. And maybe civilians will sue you in civil courts for the damages you did. But we want the higher ups. We want you to name names. Who ordered you to kill these people when? Because all of that was documented. And you know what? It worked. It worked because they were facing prosecution. And so they ratted out their superiors. And the good news is all of the junta members that ruled Argentina from 76 to 82 eventually went to jail, and most of them died in jail. So there is a way. You go to these tank commanders today, once this thing is over, and say, we know that you shelled apartment blocks, and you weren't taking any fire from them. That's a war crime. But we want to know who gave you the order to do that, because we know that the Russian command and control system is very centralized. So you wouldn't have the initiative to do it on your own, that you would be going outside the chain of command. We know this. So who was the colonel who gave the order? Or did it come from the Kremlin? Shell civilian population centers. And that way you may be able to bring enforcement into the picture, because then you've got them fingered as the material and intellectual authors of war crimes, and the international community can seek to prosecute them on those grounds. Again, there's a lot more involved in that, but I just think that coming out of this will be an appreciation that if you don't have the norms and rules, then literally you have a Hobbesian state of nature. For Hobbes, the state of nature was anarchy. And he basically said, absent some sovereign, some Leviathan, then countries will just go at it based on their relative resource capabilities. So it's anarchy. The whole liberal international system is designed to overcome anarchy, to put order into the relations between states, and to peacefully resolve conflict. Heck, we even have here in New Zealand a center for conflict resolution and peace studies. I mean, it's an understanding that otherwise anarchy will prevail, might will make right, and all of us will suffer as a result sooner or later. I think authoritarians looking at this, especially if Putin is defeated, see, they're going to learn a lesson too. And it'll be, I don't think I'm going to try that. If he succeeds, they may say, oh, I could do this vis-a-vis one of my neighbors. If he loses, and again, I think he will lose, then authoritarians got to hold themselves in check and go, ooh, this didn't work out well, and he's a big power. So that I think will mitigate against more of this type of wars of aggression. But more importantly, I think it will lead to a revaluation, a reappreciation of the rules-based order. And interestingly, in amongst that sort of resurgence of appreciation, New Zealand may have a very good role to play because we're one of the champions of rules-based orders. We're banging that drum all the time. Why? Because we're small and vulnerable.
Yeah,
You
you
know,
need
we want rules.
multilateralism. Yeah.
Yeah, and we want rules checking the power of great powers. You know, we don't want people to run around unfettered in international relations, bullying their way. And so we have a deep appreciation already as a small state that rules do matter, but rules only matter if they can be enforced, and that's where we are today.
That's where we are today. So let's wrap this up. So the enduring questions that we've been working through there are simply, if a reset is needed, and it does appear that a reset is required, 2022 is definitely showing that this is the case. What does that reset look like? And that's what Paul and I have been discussing. Before we go, I'll just read through a couple of the questions that have come in. David Mooring, for example, he's put a comment in, not questions. And he says, I'll just bring it up on screen so those who are watching can see it. He says, the real reason the West didn't do enough resisting the Russian invasion of Georgia going back in August 2008, or Crimea in February, March 2014. So Putin thought it would be the same for Ukraine. And I think you're right there, David. Paul and I talked about the underestimations that were happening. I'll just bring that one down off screen, put this one up. This is very kind of Donna Marie Lawson. She says, finally an analysis worth hearing. Thank you. Thank you to you too, Donna. That's seriously cool.
Thanks,
David Mooring, he's made a couple of other comments here as we've gone through the program, and I think they are good ones to include here as we wrap up. David Mooring says, otherwise, maybe Putin's strategy was to create a massive crisis, call in Boris Johnson and Trump to broker a peace in our time type deal favourable to Putin's interests. Well, I've seen that being referred to in other places, but Donald Trump has certainly got his problems back home. And Boris Johnson has too. I don't think they're going to go in there and try and be the peacemakers in this instance, but it's out there. That comment's out there. And finally, David makes mention here, the West didn't do enough resisting, and he goes back to that initial position. Didn't the West in some way has responsibility for creating, I guess this is me paraphrasing David's position there, but the West has some responsibility for not creating a situation where a deterrent was real, and the situation in the Russian Federation is they've found a way to go about that, and that certainly does not help the people that are facing death and destruction on an hourly basis in Ukraine.
Let me just say one thing to David. David, I agree with you. In fact, Selwyn and I have talked about this. He did telegraph what he was going to do with the invasions in Georgia, Crimea, what you mentioned. Absolutely, he telegraphed it. I beg to differ when it comes to what we should have done in the past. I mean, hindsight is great, but the Obama administration had many different, things that it was juggling. The war on terror. It's like we all forgot about the war on terror. That sort of thing. Remember, Georgia was 2008. I mean, Obama wasn't even in office at that point. And the hunt for bin Laden was the biggest priority. So, if we decontextualize our retrospective analysis of how the Russians managed to get to this point today, then we lose sight of the circumstances, the original circumstances, even though, again, he did telegraph the deal. But I would not put an iota of blame on the West for Russia's actions. I think that's
the decisions. The decisions lay with those that make them, don't they?
Yeah, they had options. The Ukrainians, they wanted to join NATO, but that's because they weren't being given guarantees by the Russians that they wouldn't behave aggressively towards them. I mean, it's a complex, kettle of fish. And so he telegraphed his move. They tried to forestall him. That made the Ukrainians nervous. So they were talking about NATO, but it was in the early talk phases. There was many opportunities. So I will say this, my bottom line is that Putin moved mostly for domestic reasons, not for foreign affairs reasons. This was a move to consolidate his authority back at home in the face of a declining demographic. The country is sliding now, and Selwyn mentioned, very dependent on fossil fuel exports. And I should point out, we've mentioned this before, the Russian economy is the size of Texas. It is less, or it's smaller than the Italian economy. So this was not, by any stretch of the imagination, the move of a strong self-confident state. I think it was a move by a dictator facing decline, and he did the very typical stage a foreign adventure, rally nationalist support, and hopefully prevail. The bad news is that every time authoritarians try to do that, they wind up being defeated, and then they wind up being ousted. So just think of the Argentine generals going into the Falklands Malvinas. They could have stayed in power for many more years, but they decided to pick a fight with the British because there was some economic problems in Argentina, and that was the end of their regime. The Greek colonel's regime picked a fight with the Turks in Crete, and they were defeated, and that was the end of that military regime, so on and so forth. So I think this is his Achilles heel. I think that, it may take longer, than we had anticipated, but all of this, in the end, I think had a domestic origin. And his miscalculations based on his dictatorial isolation have led him to this point, and he's not going to be able to get out of it honorably. He likely will be up for prosecution. See, he could become the test case of how a sitting national leader can be charged with war crimes and then prosecuted, even if in absentia. See, if they prosecute him in absentia, sentence him to life in prison, well, he can't leave Russia, that's for sure. But it's going to be an uncomfortable existence. And you can be sure that if those sort of things happen, his rivals inside and outside of the Kremlin will do their utmost to deliver him to justice. So I still think, that we're going to come out better for this war, but the cost could well be astronomical, especially for the Ukrainian people. And that's where NATO, the United States, they need to come to some hard decisions. Do we let this go on and have it turn into a genocide, or do we try to stop it now, give him some avenue of escape, and hopefully minimize the collateral damage and civilian casualties that otherwise would ensue?
Okay, thank you for that, Paul. Thank you for your contribution and your company today, and also for those that have taken part in the program while we've been live. If you continue the conversation online through via the social media platforms at the end of this program, one of the things that we'd like to leave you with is, once again, if the global international rules-based order needs a reset, what does that reset look like? And those kind of dialogues would be very interesting to read and very helpful, I'd imagine, too. Until this time next week, which will be Thursday midday New Zealand time, which is in the early evening United States Eastern time, take care out there. We look forward to your company once again. Goodbye.